right, so welcome everyone. Welcome to our webinar. On behalf of Source Intelligence, I'd like to appreciate your attendance and introduce you to our topic of the day, which is taking control, medical device supply chain compliance. Excited to guide you through a little bit and to give you a little bit of introduction into this exciting topic. But before we do, I'd like to go over a couple quick housekeeping notes and items. So first and foremost, if you have any questions, of course we do invite them. Down at the bottom of your toolbar, you will see that there is a question section. And inside of that, we will take those questions. We will answer a couple pre-submitted questions that came in early, but do not fear. In the event that we do not get to your question specifically before time beats us, we will be sure to respond to you. In terms of accessing webinar resources, this event will be recorded and it will be available for you to download, as will the slides at the end of the program. You will receive an email with instructions on how to do so. But if you have any additional questions or anything comes up post facto, feel free to reach on in to marketing@sourceintel.com and we'll make sure you get everything that you're looking for. In terms of our next step, if you have any resources or any questions that you might be seeking, specifically related to certain regulations, certain topics, other content that might be meaningful to you, stop on by our Source Intelligence Resource Center, where you can get access to regulatory blogs, ebooks, webinars, on-demand content, quarterly newsletters, and of course, Source Academy, which is our learning management system comprised of a series of different rules and regulations and background that might help you out with either your continuing education credits or just give you a deep dive into a specific topic of interest for you. Without further ado, let's jump on into the agenda. So to lead things off, I'll give you a quick introduction to our panelists today, followed by a regulatory overview. And that's just going to be a quick brushstrokes, over what it is that's most impactful to the medical device industry, what we've been seeing from our perspective. We'll transition over to some of the implications to medical device procurement teams, which is designed and developed by our very own Kevin Nelson, who's a former chief supply chain officer at Becton Dickinson. From there, we'll migrate over to risk management alignment, hosted by David Chillingford, who was the former founder of Everstream Analytics. And then post that, we're going to jump into operation and compliance with Source Intelligence, kind of tying everything together and showing you how some of these workflows develop. Excellent. Now, of course, we have to unfortunately send our regrets, as all of us should probably have business continuity programs at this point. A snowstorm came through the eastern half of the United States and unfortunately has taken away power and Wi-Fi for our very own Kevin Nelson. So we wish him well, but unfortunately he will not be available today to give a presentation. Do not fear. My good colleague David Shillingford and I will see it through. So David, maybe to get started, could you make a quick introduction to yourself and the topic that you'll be discussing today?
Sure. Very happy to be here, Travis. Sorry Kevin can't make it. He adds a ton to these things, so we'll do our best to fill in for him. I've had a few different careers myself, first as an army officer, then as an entrepreneur, then as an investor, and now as an advisor to companies like Source Intelligence. So I'm looking forward to this, and my focus is to look at the ecosystem around the compliance challenges that Travis is going to be describing and point to some of the opportunities that result from that for compliance departments.
Amazing. Thank you, good sir. And then for my background, for those of you that don't know me, my name is Travis Miller. I'm an attorney, environmental scientist. I've been at this for 20 years in various capacities along the way. I did 2 tours of duty internally, one with Microchip Technologies. I actually consulted for St. Jude Medical for a number of times, implementing a validated system. And most recently, actually, I worked at Google up until joining Source Intelligence as the Chief Strategy Officer and General Counsel. All right, so topic of my favorite is regulatory and what it is that you have to do. So let's jump into a regulatory overview. Well, first and foremost, over the course of the last year, since I started, I've been on a series of roundtables, talking with you and your colleagues and really starting to understand what it is that is most impactful to the medical device industry. So when I talk about supply chain compliance, I specifically mean the product, the physical good. And a topic that we came across quite often was the divergent meanings of supply chain compliance. Specifically, you have your entity-based screenings, which are going to be trade-based rules and regulations, denied parties, other disclosures or evaluations you have to make about who you trade with. But when I say supply chain compliance in our topic today, we're very much talking about the what you buy. What are those physical goods? How are they impacted by costs, tariffs, countries of origin, ROS, REACH, PFAS, TSCA, conflict minerals, anti-slavery provisions, the UFLPA, California Transparency and Supply Chain Act, to give some examples. The POPs regulation, persistent organic pollutants, restricted substance specifications, California's Proposition 65, the extended producer responsibility regulations, the battery directive, obsolescence, what happens when you find something or something goes end of life. And then, of course, a big topic for the industry, the medical device regulation. What happens to qualify those materials, the carcinogens, anything that might touch or impact the human body, and make sure that it's safe so it can be imported and used for its intended purpose. Now, as my wife likes to say, when she talks about growing up and the kids, every level has a devil, and the same thing's true for your products. At its very top level assembly, you've got the reporting obligations, the filings, those digital product passports, customs disclosures. As you start to break that down, you'll find assemblies, and those assemblies are made by someone. And that's where you can start to find some forced labor, some packaging requirements, imports of physical discrete goods. When you go a tier below that, you start to hit components. And components are going to be full of obligations, whether that's reaches, ROSs, obsolescence, materials, different types of restrictions about what it is that is inside of that product. And of course, materials are where the PFAS, the TSCAs, the Prop 65s, the conflict minerals, and the EU MDR requirements start to hit. Because it's really about what you're touching, what you're interacting with, the thing that was extracted or harvested. But prior to that, you start to get to processing steps. How did those materials get extracted? Did they come from a farm, from a mine, from a lab? And as they did so, are they safe? Were they extracted in an ethical way? Are they going to be associated with any tariffs or impacts if they're imported and assembled domestically? And that, of course, yields that last tier in the supply chain, the actual extractive or harvesting. And that's where rules and regulations, some of those complex that we see, the deforestation regulation, the battery directive, the UFLPA, the forced labor bans, all of those are really focused and tied to that first extraction, that first action of starting to harvest a good, because it still remains very human capital intensive. Now, we asked this question, and when we got response back from the medical device industry, this is what we heard. In terms of the rules and regulations that are most pressing to you, the ones that have the most impact, you can see my little donut chart here. You told us that one of these regulations was the number one most impactful to you. So, what do we learn from this? Very diversified kind of a segment. We learned a couple things. European regulations are still dominating the mind share. Over half of you told us that Europe's MDR, the SKIP regulation, REACH, ROS, the POPs regulation, the extended producer responsibility requirements take up the lion's share of your time and work. Now, we also learned that that geographic preference extends into North America. With the same EPR regulations at the state level, conflict minerals, PFAS, and TSCA taking up the remainder of the circle, and that little other category, that happened to be almost entirely tariffs and physical costs that were associated with materials. So generally speaking, David, what do you think about this as an initial high-level assessment before we dive into the regulations a little deeper? I know you come from a business continuity background.
Yeah, I mean, I think business continuity, or rather supply chain continuity, is top of mind for executives, board of directors, and as I hear you describe this, compliance risk is operational risk. If you can't make or sell what it is that your business makes and sells, whether it's a regulatory reason, it's still an operational risk. And the role of compliance in ensuring that what you design and what you make and what you ship is compliant is becoming more and more important. But it's also, I think, as this slide shows, is becoming more and more complex, and that complexity shifts and changes every day. So it is this is something that companies ignore at their peril.
Fantastic. All right, well, let's dive in a little deeper. So first and foremost, in the namesake, our medical device regulation. So the MDR was really intended for four essential purposes: improving safety, offering some interpretation of what MDD is and start to combine that into more standardized workflows. Because of the ISO 13485 limitations, and to support companies in their efforts to monitor and evaluate change. Now, the regulation has been in effect for some time now, and we've gone through a lot of the first waves where we had to identify and triage materials, and we went through some transition periods. Those transition periods are all ending in the next 24 months. Almost insane to think about because we've been at it for so long. But we're talking about the end of the derogation for Class 3 custom-made implantables coming in this May. The end of the transition period for Class 3 and Class 2B implantable devices the year after. The end of the transition period for almost all other device and sterile measuring devices. That's going to take place in 2028. So in just a few short years, less than 24 months from now, the EU MDR will have fully implemented and replaced the old medical device directive, meaning that your systems have to be up, functional, operational, and validated, ready to go to meet these transitory requirements. Now, an analogous rule and regulation, another oldie but goodie, has been the EU REACH regulation. That's the restriction, evaluation, authorization, and restriction of chemicals. Every several years, the REACH regulation goes through evaluation by the Regulatory Scrutiny Board, or the RSB. And what they found is that they generally have a negative opinion of the proposed REACH revisions. What does that mean? Well, it means that they have evaluated not only what the REACH regulation is, but what it should be and how it can be improved to be more meaningful to the European community. And they found that there are missing information sets, there are risks to health and the environment that are in place, there's incomplete usage of information, polymers are not adequately covered, there's safety assessments that do not have sufficient detail. They've also specified that there is insufficient process, meaning that restriction process is too slow, authorizations aren't moving fast enough, and there's insufficient compliance across the suppliers and manufacturers that are bringing in products and materials that might be in scope or regulated. Also true that enforcement is highly variable, and imports, specifically those online, fail to meet REACH regulations. Meaning that if you're ordering something from some of the large-scale retailers, the online importers, they are not satisfying the REACH regulation requirements for their imports. This means that we are going to expect change. And originally that change was supposed to get proposed in Q4 of 2025. We anticipate that the negative opinions are going to cause the drafters, the various authorities, to go back and to seek new revisions and changes that will address these proposed revisions. It also means that there might be substantial enough of a change that the REACH regulation becomes a conformity Europa mark or a CE mark. And you would have to have technical file inserts in order to import any product that aligns to REACH. Next slide. This is also true for what's happening in the ROS regulation and all of the updates that are currently taking place for lead in metal alloys. So lead is a ubiquitous substance, something that finds its way into multiple different materials, and it's really, really good for what it does. It also happens to be highly toxic and something that Europe has sought to phase out since at least 2006. So we are seeing more prescriptive and more precise implementation of exemptions that are phasing out more and more use cases that we've relied upon in the past, with caps and new exemptions for steel, aluminum, and copper. We anticipate that the member states will be transposing these regulations and these new requirements by June 30th of 2026, meaning that you are going to have to either have applied for or go through and commit to the reduction of certain usages of lead across your supply chain going forward. It is also the case that the US has not been sleeping on these types of substance control rules and regulations. In fact, in just about a month, the reporting obligation and the reporting portal for PFAS will open, meaning that if you have not conducted due diligence into the presence, location of PFAS materials within your supply chain, you're probably in a pretty significant rush right now because you're going to have to look back for all the materials that you imported and all the products that you imported or disposed of that had PFAS materials from January 1st of 2011 all the way through December 31st of 2022. That is a huge burden, particularly for large scale companies or manufacturers. And for most of us that probably did not have all of those records in place because we were never asked to evaluate PFAS materials at that time. Next slide. These rules and requirements were not bans at the US level, but they certainly have become bans at the state level. The most impactful that is phased in to date is probably the Minnesota rule, where those reporting obligations and actual prohibitions on the use of this material has come into effect. It's one of the number one reasons why the Dow chemical authorities and 3M are phasing out these materials, both of which that have heavy presence inside of Minnesota. And without these materials, it means that you're not going to have Teflon, certain flexible plastic tubings, ruggedized plastics and materials. A whole series of vital materials are going to all of a sudden no longer be available, or the costs to receive them are going to absolutely surge. Meaning that for those of us in the medical device community with validated materials, formulations, blends, we run a very significant and real risk that those material types are no longer going to be available. And the net result is the revalidation process, which can require several years to prove efficacy and approval, may put us in a real significant bind where we lose access to certain materials that are vital for us to keep those life-saving products and materials on the market. Now, Europe is also watching closely what the United States is doing. And as part of the REACH updates and revisions, we are anticipating PFAS being added to that REACH regulation, meaning that those guidance documents that have come out are going to be translated into consultations. Those consultations are going to find their way into mapping guidelines and controls, and those, in fact, are going to find their way into the REACH regulation. We strongly anticipate that SVHC, substances of very high concern going forward, are going to feature PFAS materials. And you need to be aware that that market access risk is not going to be limited to just the United States, but it's most certainly going to translate, globally, particularly overseas to Europe, probably next. Now, Europe is not just regulating stuff that comes from labs, they're also regulating things that come from the ground. And things that come from the ground or that are grown are largely being regulated at their highest and most difficult status by the European Union deforestation regulation, which has been kicked back several times already, but is probably now finally entered into its final state. And what that means for us is that, unfortunately, anybody that engaged in a lot of EUDR due diligence over the course of the last several years probably did that as, let's say, a trial run, because it's not really going to be adequate for what comes next. It also means that our first filings are going to be due this year. So if you've been holding off or waiting for that big moment where you actually know what those obligations are, it is upon us. And if you did a bunch of work or effort in the past, it's probably time to speak to your solution provider, reevaluate that, and just see if it's still any good or if you can still use it. Now, those same rules and regulations impacting materials are also impacting recyclability. And recyclability is best framed in the extended producer responsibility rules and regulations. I remember when I first got started in this industry, way back in the 2000s, early years, when we were considering and talking about the EPR regulations, we were pretty much talking about Europe. There's a couple things going on in Japan, but that was about it. Flash forward 25 years later. Oh boy, I can't believe I just said that. 25 years later, still in the same industry, and pretty much every continent, sans Antarctica, maybe they have something now too, I don't know, is now has an EPR regulation of some flavor, shape, or form, either in progress, in the works. You have multiple different state-specific rules and regulations that have kicked in. The fee-paying obligations have been adopted almost universally as a funding source and a way that we can ensure recycling can occur in a given jurisdiction. Now, in the United States, we are seeing a major increase in the state-specific EPR rules, and it seems to very much be following the model of Europe. So just within Source Intelligence, we actively maintain over 300 of these regulations. That's a mind-boggling number. So we've already gone through all of the European, all of the Canadian, all of the Latin American, a lot of the Asia Pac implementations. As of this year, there are 7 states that currently have EPR packaging laws on the books, and there are another roughly 12 to 15 that look like they are going to be passed and come into force sometime over the next several years. This means that going forward, for any of you that are US-centric manufacturers, importers, or sellers, you should anticipate having to calculate these fees and costs, do reporting to the packaging recycling organizations, and to start to engineer your packaging to be more recyclable going forward. All right. Well, that was a mouthful. So, David, just as I take a drink of water, what are your thoughts? You've been at this a long time. Have you ever seen a surge of regulations like this before? What would be your advice to our community out there?
Yeah, I mean, your first section was about the complexity of the materials itself and the different levels of material all the way down to the chemicals that companies need to understand. And listening to the last bit that you explained is just the complexity of the regulatory framework, the uncertainty, the state of flux that it is in. I mean, the companies that I speak to who have been trying to do this themselves are really struggling. And it's not what makes their beer taste better. This isn't the business that they are in. The business that they are in is making medical devices and saving lives and making people healthy. And for them to be diverting enormous growing resources towards this that is critical to get right is becoming less and less interesting to them, and they need external help with what is essentially a big data problem where you've got increasing complexity around material data on one side, increasing complexity around regulatory data on the other side. You bring those two together and the outcomes and the variables become exponential. And without the right data and without the right systems, it's not just difficult to know whether you're complying or will be complying, or whether the products that you're designing and building will be compliant. It's really impossible to do that without the right systems in place.
Amazing. Thank you for the insights. All right, so I'm going to take a deep breath here and try to do my best poor facsimile of Kevin Nelson, which cannot, quite be easily imitated. So I'm going to take you through Kevin's golden screw concept. And, forgive me, for my errors, Kevin, in advance, as I know you'll be watching this recording at some point. So David, I'll tag team you in here from time to time. Okay, so first and foremost, the golden screw concept that Kevin introduced to me, I thought was just remarkable. Uh, so in this world where he has served as the chief procurement officer for Becton Dickinson, has been in supply chain his entire life and career. He gave me the example of how a single screw could cause the failure of an organization. And I thought that was a little silly at first until he explained it. So what he said was, let's just take a single component, something simple, that find its way into a bill of materials. To do so, that single screw would have to be validated. It would have had to have been tested. Would have had to have gone through the full design cycle by engineering, by regulatory, by efficacy, by quality. And as a result, if you had an approved component, supplier part combination, all the other engineers would want to use that same screw because it would drastically alleviate the burden and the multiple years that it would take to qualify a specific product that had that specific material. So the result of that is that that single screw or that single material would very quickly replicate itself and find its way across the entire company's supply chain. So let's imagine that we have ourselves a diabetes pump. And that diabetes pump, has 600 to 1,000 items in its bill of materials, maybe 30 to 50 first tier suppliers. And then that screw is buried somewhere in the 2 to 400 sub tier suppliers that have a qualified or approved material type. Any number of these regulations that we've been describing, any one of them independently could prove to be a showstopper. Because if that component, say, had hexavalent chromium, it could be restricted. And it might not shut down a single product line. Rather, it might shut down multiple product lines and revenue streams and cause significant delays or impact trying to find alternative materials. So let's think about that a slightly different way. Next slide. So the foundational question that ends up getting asked across the supply chain is who's going to manage this and how? Because all too often, everyone across the compliance obligation and all the multiple teams are trying to solve a single problem. And if they're not effectively looking at the same database or sharing what they learn, they're only solving a portion of that problem. So let's kind of look at that continuum. So at the top level, you've got your engineering team who's basically asking, well, what components are in there and are they going end of life? You might have your sanctions team that's looking at the nth tier to see if there might be a part or a product that has Russian, Ukrainian, or Chinese-based goods that could have a control over the next denied party list. People are going to be looking in the product compliance function to see if there's a restricted substance in any of the products. And R&D is going to be trying to see if their projects are compliant so that they can move them forward into the first tier of prototyping. There's going to be a trade team that's interested to know if there's impacts from tariffs and what those costs might look or feel like. And then somebody's going to be concerned with the nth tier supply chain and if all those materials and components are coming from ethical actors. Someone's going to want to know if any of those nth tier supplied parts are going to be impacted by tariffs. And if you're seeing them, or if you're just getting cost increases that are flowed through without any rhyme or reason, or having any visibility into if they're actually a valid claim of tariff increases and costs. There's also going to be finished good considerations, like is the packaging subject to EPR regulations and where? And does that product in fact contain PFAS related material? That's going to obligate you to make some form of a report or disclosure. Compound that by the number of teams, the factories, the legal functions, the shared services, the suppliers, the sustaining engineering organizations, the commercial business, the regulatory, the R&D, and very quickly the number of permutations that people have that are all interacting to answer different questions that are all interrelated becomes overwhelming. And the result is that no individual has all the information needed to answer the question, is this product compliant? So what we do at Source Intelligence, and what Kevin had recommended you do, is flip the script. And to do so, to establish and create a competitive advantage. So don't think about your products as discrete things per se. It is important that product A and product C become compliant. But it is equally important and probably a better course of action to think about your products with the S at the end as the sum of all the components and suppliers that contribute to them. Because if it is the case that that golden screw could impact product line A, G, E, F, and B, then it's not the case that you need to evaluate each of those independently. It's much more effective if you had evaluated the holistic combination of all of those parts and components by the supplier so that you could see exactly what those impacts are and plan for it. How did I do, David? That was my best pass at being a Kevin.
Yeah, that's good. I've known Kevin for years, and I work with him on a lot of these, and that is how he has learned to think about it. I looking across the industry, I think there's a fundamental both cultural and operational difference between companies who've adopted this way of thinking and those that haven't. And as the months go by, the companies that haven't adopted this way of thinking are gonna be hit in the back of the head by more and more surprises because the golden screw concept exists. People assume that it's an outlier, but in fact, it's not. Mathematically speaking, it occurs all over the supply chain. And to understand that you have a reliance upon what might be a small part of your supply chain when you add up spend, if that can bring your production to a halt, then focusing purely on prioritizing risk assessment by spend is in itself not enough. And companies that put all of their efforts into third-party risk management, which is important, they'll miss this concept of the golden screw. And it's not just compliance. Operational risk is also subject to if I can't access a certain product because a factory fire in the third tier of my supply chain has taken a supplier out and I don't have any alternatives, that's something that will ripple through to production pretty quickly. And if you know that that is a tier 3 supplier and it is a sole source supplier ahead of time, you can have contingency plans. And for the companies that find out about that from their tier 1 supplier, it's too late. So it's, as you said at the top, it's an enormous competitive advantage, and increasingly so for companies to have this type of visibility, to be able to understand this during design, during the planning and the execution of their supply chains. It has ramifications way beyond compliance. So I think with the themes that you put on the table, Travis, the one that I want to build on, which is an enormous opportunity for compliance and for enterprises beyond compliance, is to understand the connectivity between the functions and the outcomes that compliance is looking for and the functions and outcomes that other business groups and other functions are looking for. And the common element across all of this is data. So I'm going to talk a bit about the commonality of data from compliance to other functions and other outcomes, but I'll start by talking a bit about the why, because cross-functional collaboration is a tough thing. And without a compelling reason behind it, it can be difficult for one function to collaborate with another. If I think about it at as high level as I can, one of the conversations that every enterprise is having right now is around artificial intelligence and what are the opportunities to leverage artificial intelligence across the enterprise. And in order to do that, the fundamental building block is having the right data in the right place. That's very high level, but it's a theme that I'll come back to at the end of this. A more specific example of why compliance can be superheroes beyond the compliance function is if we think about supply chain risk management in its broader terms. And we've touched on this a couple of times already. But if you go to the next slide, the way to think about supply chain risk management in an enterprise is to think about it as anything that can disrupt the flow of materials and goods through to final production and final sale. In other words, there is risk to revenue. And most enterprises are looking at this in a few different buckets. So they might not think of this in terms of the box in the middle. There are people in, if you look in the top left, business continuity. They're looking at the continuity of business related to assets that are owned and controlled by the enterprise. Top right, we talked a bit about third-party risk management already, so supplier risk management. Again, that's a function that is quite often being handled separately. Bottom right, thinking about the logistics risk, the ability or inability for a company to take inputs and outputs and ensure that they arrive on time and in full. And then the material risk. Do I have enough of the materials and inputs that I need in order to make the product that I make? So if you think about those as the different components of supply chain risk management, in the middle of this is the what, where, and the who. What is it that we're relying upon? What are the materials? Who are my suppliers? And where are they? Where are the factories? Where are the ports? Where are the distribution centers? So that commonality of data applies to all of these different risk functions, and it's where compliance can be extremely valuable. So if you, in the next slide, think about where does compliance, and I'll add ESG to this, overlap with those different risk management functions, the short answer is everywhere. I realize this is kind of a busy slide, but the message behind this slide is that wherever there is overlap between the green boxes of compliance and the other functions is an opportunity for the compliance function to support or to be supported by the other business functions, because there is common data that is being collected by one that is necessary and valuable for the operation of the other. So if you go to the next slide, a slightly maybe simpler way of thinking about this and representing this within your enterprise is breaking the data down into who, in other words, the supplier, the what, the product, the bill of materials, and the where, the location, the factory. And if you start going around the list that Travis was talking about earlier on, you can take each regulation and you can put it into one of these circles or one of the areas where they overlap. And the reason to do that is to start thinking about the data that is necessary to ensure and report compliance. And then the next step is to overlay that with the other types of risk functions that your enterprise is increasingly worrying about and challenged with. And you'll find that in almost every instance, the data that is being collected by compliance, often in far more detail than the other functions are collecting the data, if they're collecting it at all, has a lot of overlap with the other types of risk management functions that your company is trying to get its arms around. And the short version of this is to say, if you're in compliance, you're collecting this data. If you're not, you should probably be talking to Source Intelligence. But this data is critical to overall business continuity and overall supply chain continuity. And the opportunity for compliance departments to significantly increase the ROI of the efforts that you are going to is enormous. So I'd recommend that you take this slide or some version of it and have this discussion inside your enterprise and how you can collaborate with other groups and divisions. So I'll throw it back to you, Travis.
Tremendous. All right. So we covered a lot of what's going on. We talked a little bit about how that applies within an organization. Now, let's kind of tidy things up. We'll wrap up with how do you solve for it? And solving problems always goes back to operations. So let's talk about operationalizing compliance. So I prepared this diagram to kind of give you a visual for how it might feel to have an internal system of record, which is connected to PLM, ERP combinations, communicates with your product, sustainability, sourcing teams, has the ability to communicate through external reporting channels and external reporting systems, and then interact with your supply chain. And how that can be facilitated or aided by agentic cloud ecosystems and third-party data extractive layers. So what does that mean to you? What does that mean in a nutshell? Well, it means at some point you're going to want to protect and archive your data assets. And your data assets that are most valuable to you are probably going to be your designs, the products that you produce. But you're going to have to acquire information through exchange and huge sums of information. You know, thousands, hundreds of thousands, occasionally billions of records to deal with all the various compliance records that are happening. Storing all of that information and refreshing it on a regular cadence, it used to be 6-month cycles, is impossible at this point. In lieu of that, the only mechanism to acquire this data is through AI and agents that are connected, that are tapping into the various systems of record where interfaces have been figured out, and you can receive the information that exists just in time, exactly what you need that is most relevant. So you're always making a verdict based upon the latest available data. Because guess what? If you're not doing this, chances are the regulators are. And they will be evaluating all of these systems of record. Next slide. So along those lines, the best way to do this is through a combination of automation and agentics. So when I say automation, what am I talking about? Well, I mean connecting to your existing product lifecycle management system, Windchill in this case. They can look at what's happening with your BOMs, your parts, your approved manufacturer and vendor lists, the suppliers, those custom data fields, taps into R&D, sales, imports, is looking at documents and technical drawings and extracting data and have that evaluated for all these compliance obligations. So you know if you can ship to Europe or California or Asia Pac, wherever it might be. Supplementing and enriching that with supplier engagement, but only where you have to. Because so much of this information is going to exist in legacy compliance data. That's going to be collateral, compliance documents, document uploads, chemical information, homogeneous materials data. And then performing those surveys or the outreach and engagement through portals, file transfers, surveys, emails, dragging CMRTs off of websites, and creating that holistic view, that automated data enrichment cycle that is virtuous and allows you to benefit from the latest information. Enhance that. And you're enhancing it in ways that really weren't possible even a year ago. It's mind-boggling to see what has been unlocked. So when I think about an agentic workflow, I mean discrete tasks that are repeatable, that can be evaluated by the agents themselves. So let me explain that, because that's a bit of a heady concept. So if you ask a question to a traditional large language model, and then you come back a day later and you ask that same question, chances are you're going to get prompted for the same data inputs, and your answer is going to be a little different. Why is that? Well, the reason for that is that that system is in a constant state of flux. To use a better word, it's learning all the time. It is aggregating all the information that is available in the public domain, and its opinions on things are changing modestly. You wouldn't probably repeat the exact same answer to a question you were asked in 2 days, exactly the same. There'd be little fluctuations to your vernacular, how you describe it. Each time you say it, it's a little different. Same is true of an LLM. So the way to get repeatable processes is actually through multi-agentics. So that means that you have an orchestration layer that breaks down a query into discrete individualized tasks. In our case, it's research, get in a document, quality control, reviewing a document, campaign, asking for enhancements to a document that is inadequate or is not found. Next slide. What that does is provide you efficiency and repeatability. And we've been working on this for the last year or so. So when we talk about agentics, what we're seeing is the combination of pre, post, market surveillance and intelligence and agentic workflows. It is allowing us to drastically reduce the time spent. It used to take us about 10 minutes to download, find, review, and evaluate a document. That is down to 30 seconds or less and dropping. We're seeing a 50% decrease in supplier onboarding cycle time because of the improvements to the system. 3 to 5x faster risk detection, because that risk is actually being flagged outside of the system first through the quality review process before it even gets loaded into your tool. And it started to be addressed right then and there. And an 80% plus increase in supplier engagement because that's happening agentically with continuous support, ongoing ability to communicate, and infinite patience to work somebody through an explanation for what something means. Next slide. Now, let's talk about aligning those things. And as you would, I had a little fun with ChatGPT. So, next slide. Let's storyboard for a second. So let's just imagine you're deep in the lab and you're designing a new robotic surgery arm, latest and greatest medical device technology. And maybe just along the way, somebody asks a foundational question. I've made this product for FDA approval. Could I actually bring this to Europe? That's an important question. So in this case, you could ask that question, and the multiple CMAP instances and the agents would have the ability to break that product down into its constituent components, if you will, and identify the exact materials that were present. In this case, that golden screw is identified, not after you designed the product, not after you sent out a survey, but while you were designing the product. And then the agents would begin to communicate with one another. Multiple instances of CMAP, finding the same form, fit, and function material, the same product that you might need, but one that didn't contain that same hexavalent chromium. And as a result, during the design process, you could make that substitution. Next slide. Now, in real time, once you approve that concept, the systems could begin to communicate with the other departments. And that engineer could receive a response. You should approve or you should substitute this screw for that one. Because the second one is ROS compliant, which is a requirement for European market access. By simply clicking on that review cycle, workflows could trigger where quality and engineering are requested to go through the engineering change order to make sure the same form, fit, and function are applicable. And it's going to meet the FDA requirements that you're currently shooting for and the later requirements that are going to come. Regulatory can be asked to review the materials and the composition data to see if it's going to be compliant with both the US and the EU market, and if the chemical formulation is going to meet all those requirements. As those approvals are made, it can be directed to that strategic sourcing organization with the assurance that quality and regulatory and the engineering department have all already approved this. And then they would be instructed to buy those 250 screws that are going to be essential to make sure that golden screw failure doesn't happen to you. That in practice is what we're talking about. What I'd like to leave you with are just a couple quick takeaways before I turn it over to David to answer a few questions that have come in for him. So the first one, stop thinking about engagement. It's not about how many emails you send, the amount of work that you do. We have to get a little bit more intelligent with how we deal with this stuff. And I would encourage you to think more about coverage. How much information do I know? How few questions do I have to ask? Not how many must I ask to be able to make a statement of conformance. Second, find ways to repurpose data. You have a wealth of information at the materials level. You've probably been collecting this data since Ross came about, 2006. There's 20 years worth of information out there that's just waiting for you to tap into. Use it. And third, recognize that we can do things that we could not do 6 months ago. We're going to be able to do things that we can't even imagine in 6 months. AI will be your enabler. It will allow you to achieve what was once deemed impossible. I always go back to the last time I was at RBA, just a year or two ago. They were presenting on their metrics for evaluating potential forced labor. And they showed this slide where they had exactly the same number of findings for the last 15 or 20 years from exactly the same suppliers. That was preposterous to me. But as I looked a little deeper into that data, I found something intriguing. The reason for that is because all of the work was being done for the paper chase. It was gathering the information. It wasn't solving the problem. And all of us joined this industry in some way, shape, or form to try to solve problems. That's what we do. If we can divert some of that administrative paper chase, it allows us to really start to tackle the problems and the issues. And I'd invite you to really think about that and contemplate what the future of work might look like for you. Anything to add, David? I know I talked a lot.
No, that was great. That was very, very well said. I mean, I think that last slide of yours could almost be viewed as a virtuous cycle. The more of each of these you do, the better you become. The more you got your arms around your data, the more you can use AI, and the less you need to be sending email blasts out to suppliers and getting nothing back. There's a lot of companies in supply chain trying to figure out how and where do we leverage AI. I think this is one of the best use cases that I've seen. But as we keep saying, you've got to have your arms around your data in order for that to be able to work, and you've got to figure out how and where the human is in the loop.
All right. Let's give you a question or two. So the first one here, you have a friendly with a fond remembrance of your time at Everstream, and they've asked, how do you view the difference between this product compliance and the business continuity work that you guys used to do at Everstream, and do you see any way that the two could work together?
Yeah, I think the starting point for that discussion is the observation that compliance risk is very often an increasingly operational risk. If you can't use a supplier or you can't use a component because of compliance, if that creates disruption to your operations, it's an operational risk. And so the things that companies are relying for Everstream analytics upon to look for, predict, monitor, and solve operational disruptions, compliance is absolutely part of that. And the common data elements of what do I make, what is it made of, where do those inputs come from, who am I getting them from, is that those are questions that are common to solving the compliance puzzle and to the puzzle of understanding operational risk around geopolitics and extreme weather and things like that. So it's there's extreme overlap in terms of the data, but there is often little to no overlap in terms of how the organization is approaching the two topics. And there's an enormous opportunity for companies to close that gap. And I think the more that companies like Source Intelligence and Everstream Analytics can partner and work together, the more value they can deliver to their clients, and the more they're helping their clients bring those functional areas and data opportunities together.
Fantastic. Yeah, I'm a riff just for a second. Using our current fact pattern here. Um, I guess what I found most interesting through a lot of these partnership discussions and these communications is the unexpected risks that you identify, like the things that you couldn't have perceived until you started to combine the data sets. And I'll give you a great example. And it's what's happening right now. So I never would have contemplated in a million years that a big blizzard or a snowstorm in the Northeast would have inhibited a remote first workplace individual from coming on to a webinar. Yet here we are, and we're lacking our very own Kevin Nelson. And I could see the example where maybe that's exactly the types of business continuity or assessments you should be thinking about. But it never would have crossed my mind, had I not have seen that confluence of data sets. So, just an interesting or intriguing, real life example for the moment.
Yeah, I'll build on that, and I think third party risk is not just suppliers, but it's infrastructure as well. And as companies build more and more automation that relies on more and more power, a power outage, which will become more frequent, not less frequent, that'll bring factories, warehouses, and other operations to a halt pretty quickly. So power power is important.
Absolutely. All right, interesting one here. So this one's more for me. It asks, do you guys do any work in Australia? We're looking to get a medical device approved in the location. So interesting bit of experience. I went through this a couple times. At first, answer yes. Source Intelligence does support Australia and some other regulatory areas. One of the most interesting things I find is that usually the route to the rest of the world, aside from the US, which is clearly through the FDA, is through Europe. And the reason for that is that Europe's Conformity Europa, their CE mark and their medical device regulation statutes are modeled by a lot of other regulatory and health authorities. So by going through the European standard, building out the technical files, receiving approval, you can often abbreviate or shorten your cycle to bring a medical device into a lot of the other locations globally, which I've always found to be a fascinating thing. Australia happens to be one of those jurisdictions where a lot of their medical device rules are modeled after European ones. And by going through the technical file and the approval processes in Europe through the notified bodies and the third party assessments, you set yourself up to have a very good path to get your device approved inside of Australia. So just my 2 cents on that one. Anything to add there, David? I don't know if you have a background in such.
Well, I lived in Australia. Does that count?
Sure, sure. We got a nice suntan.
I
Smiley,
no,
happy to meet you.
I mean I think that the big topic that springs to mind there is that people mistake compliance for a business cost when in fact there's a huge amount of upside in having a well-oiled compliance machine because it's all about market access. And that question proves it right there. If you can access a market faster than your competition because you have your arms around compliance, that's a huge competitive advantage.
Fantastic. All right. Well, just looking at the clock, I think we're there. It's been a delight. Yeah, thank you so much, David, for attending and speaking with us and our
Pleasure.
audience today. And thank all of you, for coming on and attending. I look forward to seeing you, and we'll be around. Source Intelligence is on the road. Your feedback is, of course, very important to us. If you can scan this little QRS code, we would be absolutely delighted to hear from you. Any final thoughts on your side, David, before we close up shop for the day?
Well, it's a complex and uncertain world that we live in, but I learned a lot from you today. You know your stuff.
Not my first rodeo. I appreciate you, my friend. Take care, everyone. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.